Hello my beautiful magical beings, it is Dragon Slayer 15 here, and today guys we are going to be finishing, hopefully, Bakugou X Traumatized Lister, and this is part 3, I think. And just a quick warning, this episode does include scenes of murder and death, and if you don't want that at all, please leave the video now, and I'll see you next time. But without further ado, dum-dee-dee-doo, let's get into this, shall we? You sat in the common room. Both the Baku squad and the Deku squad all sitting around you. You were all watching a movie, but your mind was elsewhere. You were waiting for the perfect opportunity to leave, but with the others in the room, you knew you needed to come up with an excuse. He was down the block, right where you had left him. You hoped that he was still asleep when you got there. All you needed was an excuse to disappear. You turned to Kirishima, who was sitting next to you, and you told him you were going to bed early. He gave you a quiet thumbs up, and you got up and walked to your room. Once you got inside, you grabbed a black bag from your closet, opened your window, and threw the bag out, and it landed on the ground with a soft thud. You activated your quirk and morphed into a small black cat, then carefully crawled your way to the outer windowsill, and miraculously was able to pull the window down, but not all the way so you could get back in. You climbed a small tree that lay nearby, deactivated your quirk, morphed back, grabbed the bag, and took off running down the block. The room was dark, or at least he thought it was. He could feel some kind of blindfold over his eyes, restraints tightly binding his wrist behind his back, and the taste of a cloth gag in his mouth. Where was he? Suddenly, he felt something rub up against his leg, and he flinched, and a small meow sounded from the ground. He relaxed. It's just a cat, he thought to himself. Then he heard what sounded like human footsteps. He struggled against his restraints, trying to break them somehow. Then he heard a quiet voice shush him. "Shh, stay quiet," it said. He didn't make the connection that it was you. He hadn't recognized your voice. Good. You walked around him for a moment and stopped at his back and untied his blindfold. He opened his eyes and stared around for a moment. Then you walked in front of him. Immediately, his blood boiled, and he struggled against his restraints, trying to move the chair closer. You simply turned around and walked a short distance away, and pulled out a small revolver from the bag. Seeing the gun, he froze, staring at you with wild eyes. "What are you going to do with that?" he pleaded desperately. You smirked, and that smirk stretched across your face until you most certainly looked crazy. You could see the terror in his eyes. It filled you with a sense of euphoria. It felt so good to finally be dominant over him. You walked over to him and behind him once again and untied one of his hands and placed the gun into his open palm. He stared at the gun as if unsure what to do. Before he could act, you morphed into a large black dog and growled at him. He flinched and he stared at you intensely. "We're gonna play a little game, you and I. Now, put the gun to your temple and pull the trigger," you said, as you morphed back and watched. He did as you said. The gun went off. His blood spraying the wall opposite of him, and he slumped in his chair, the gun slipping out of his hand and clattering on the floor. You picked it up carefully and put it in your bag and slung the bag over your shoulder. One thing you did make sure of before leaving was grabbing rubber gloves so that nobody would be able to notice your DNA on any object. You grabbed the back of the chair and dragged him up 2 flights of stairs to the roof of the building. You sat him in the middle of the roof and grabbed a container of kerosene that you had put nearby. You doused his entire body in the strong-smelling liquid, dropped your bag on the ground next to him, and stepped back. Now was the last part of the plan. The spectacle. You sat on the edge of the roof, struck a match, and flung it into the puddle of kerosene, and watched it go up in flames rather quickly. And you morphed back into that black cat, and jumped off the roof into a nearby tree. And with every bit of adrenaline that had been flooding through your veins through the entire procedure, you sprinted down the block back to the dorms. Once you got back, you scaled up the tree next to your window and jumped on the outer windowsill. You carefully slid your way in the small gap that you had left for yourself. You morphed back quickly and shut and locked the window. You quickly changed into an oversized t-shirt and shorts and walked out of your room rubbing your eyes. You walked into the common room to see everybody sitting around the TV. There was now a news broadcast on, and apparently the fire had gotten to the police really quickly. Kirishima turned around and saw you standing there. "Oh, are you okay?" he said. Sleepily you mumbled, "Yeah, I'm fine. What's going on?" you said as you sat down on the couch. "Apparently somebody lit a fire at the top of that old abandoned building about a block down. Who knows what could have caused it?" You stared at the TV. "Well, I hope everyone's okay," you said. "Homeless people haven't been in that house for years," you heard Bakugou say from the other side of the room. You looked over at Bakugou to see him just staring intently at the TV. It was weird. It was super strange to see him so immersed in something that wasn't combat or a competition. He was just watching it in awe. And it made you happy. You knew that if your DNA was recovered on the gun, on his body, you could say that, well, he had forced you into a game of Russian roulette. And that you didn't die, obviously, but he got the unlucky bullet. And the only way you thought of disposing of his body was burning it on the top of the roof. It wasn't the greatest alibi, but you knew it would work somehow. The news broadcast went on for about another hour as the firemen were able to put out the fire and get the body. They weren't able to identify him at that point, and that made you really happy. Then everybody went to bed, uneasy. Could they still be out there? Some people were saying. And it made you super just elated. It was interesting to see a secret about you. But before you went into your room, Bakugou stopped you at your door. Then he wrapped his arms around you in a hug. You were a little confused. "Are you okay?" you said, slightly pulling away. Bakugou stared at you and took his hand and lifted your chin so you'd look at him in the eye. Then he leaned down and kissed you on the lips. It caught you off guard. Big time. But then you began to enjoy it and wrapped your arms around his neck lovingly. The kiss seemed to last forever, and it was the most amazing feeling. The adrenaline of the night and the euphoria of this kiss, it sent your brain into overdrive. Then Bakugou pulled away. "I love you, listener," he said. "I love you too," he said. And you gave him a hug, and he hugged you back gratefully. The two of you pulled away from each other, and you could hear what sounded like Kirishima giggling down the hall. Bakugou turned, his face contorting into a scowl. "Weird hair, I swear to All Might, If you are in that hallway, I'm gonna blast you all the way to hell, he said, and began to storm off toward the sound of Kirishima's giggling. You chuckled to yourself. You were so lucky to have a guy like him. Then you realized something. You had touched him, and you didn't panic. He had kissed you, and you didn't panic. You were so relieved. There was one more person that you could trust now. One more person that you were willing to let touch you. And it was nice. It was probably one of the best feelings you'd ever experienced. Over the course of the next several days, the body was identified as the body of your ex, but there was no suspect, and people had assumed that he had committed suicide and tried to make a spectacle of his death. Apparently, the police had known about the previous court hearings, and they were glad that he was dead. When Kirishima told you, you stared at him for a second, and then he smiled. Good. I'm glad he's dead. You chuckled for a second. Yeah. But I wonder, who do you think killed him? What? Kirishima said. I don't think he killed himself. I mean, if he did... Why? He had nothing to lose. He had you, Kirishima said, as he leaned up against the door of your room. You hadn't thought about that. I guess he did have something to lose. And it was you that he had to lose. I guess Kirishima was right. He had lost you. But it didn't matter. You had brought your own personal justice to him, and you knew you were never going to get caught for this. Witnesses came to testify about it, but no one could see you. And yet, you wondered, would they be after you? Would they try and hunt you down? Would they do everything they could to try to find you if they did find out that you were a suspect? But you tried not to think about that. You were happy. And you were lucky to never have to deal with him, ever again.